I'm good to go.
He did that.
Well, actually, I have 6:58. I would hate.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here. No, this is the wrong audience, isn't it? Where's the cool? Where's the man? There he is, back there, the Reverend Cool.
Oh, we got a couple more people coming in the door here.
No, they want you to call the court to order.
Don't judge me, sir.
Oh, is it?
Okay, just because you two want me to do it. Oh, I gotta stand up for you. Before I even give you my name, I was a deputy sheriff here in Sonoma County for 69 years. Yeah, right. 39, but it seemed like 69. I got a couple co-workers over here. And I always made pretty light of opening court. And I got clued in by Judge Link Mahan back in 74. Yeah, that's when I started working for Link Mahan in Superior Court 1. One day, we were on a break in the middle of the morning, and he's sitting in the secretary's office with the door open to the hallway. And I'm standing out in front of the hall there. He's got his robes on, and he goes, great sense of humor. He says, "Prithee, bailiff, cry the court." So I held on to the door and I yelled down the hallway, "Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, all ye have grievances before the bench and bar, stand forward and ye shall be heard. This court stands open." And I turned to him and said, "You've just been prith." Anyway, my name is John Schubert. As I just said, I worked for Sonoma County for 39 years. And we started out, along with my significant other, Sarah, over here, we started out down at the old courthouse downtown. And we recognized what was going on, what was going to happen, because he had already moved a lot of the offices up to where the county complex is now. And I kept looking around, and I knew that I was seeing history. It's going to be torn down the following year. And so I was very much aware of experiencing history, that it was no longer going to be there. It was going to be the composition of Santa Rosa was going to change completely, to which it has. During the time I was at the sheriff's office, I experienced 3 years on the road, and then I got temporarily assigned. I'm laughing to myself. Temporarily assigned to the courts because they were short-handed. And when you work in the courts back in those days, you opened court at 8:30, you recessed at 12, this is basic, 12, you reconvened at 1:30, then you recessed at 4:30. You were inside an air-conditioned building, or it was heated during the winter time. You weren't out on the road. You weren't working graveyard or swing shift. You weren't making arrests. You weren't doing paperwork. You didn't have to justify what you did out on the road. Weekends off. You got all the holidays off. And my fellow cohorts, they were out there working dog shift, the graveyard shift, coming in and trying to judge and testify in court. And I'm sitting there. And I was kind of, especially during civil court, I had a lot of time on my hands, and I was kind of interested in local history, i.e. Guerneville, because that's where my grandfather bought property from Guern back in 1920, even though they had visited the area in 1914 and for about 6 years after that. But not just hearing the stories about being up in Guerneville, it's my interest in history really started talking with Mom and Dad. Well, where did you come from? And not the usual answer. Well, your great-grandfather, your grandfather would have you. I had one great-grandfather that was born up in Pine Flat near Sierraville in 1861. So now I tell my grandkids, I talked to a person who was born in 1861. And they kind of look at, yeah, right. Yeah, you were a deputy. You can't tell the truth. But, and he ended up working for his uncle in Timbuktu and Smartsville as a Wells Fargo agent, as a Wells Fargo employee. And so Mom's side of the family, they gave me all that kind of part of the story. I said, oh, this is interesting. Growing up as a little kid, the Wild West, listening to the Lone Ranger on the radio. And then there was another branch of the family that came from Canada, from Prince Edward Island. They built their own boat, their own ship, sailed around the Horn, came to San Francisco in 1850. And the father, my great-great-great-grandfather or something like that, he took a look at San Francisco. This is no place to raise a family. San Francisco in 1850, you know, you had the Barbary Coast, you had the gold rush going on like crazy, so they packed up, and they ended up being pioneers up in Humboldt County and coming into Eureka, there at Humboldt Bay, and they got established as pioneers up the Van Dusen River, and then during the Indian Wars, 2 of them got killed, and so I have roots with the state. They go back to as far as 1850, nothing really further than that. But listening to the stories of grandfather and the parents and their relatives got me, they planted the seeds of history. Oh, these are great tales, you know. So it started from that. That's where my interest started in history, was locals in state history. And then living up in Guerneville, well, where is there a book on Guerneville? Well, there wasn't any. Oh, really? So I started not doing research, just checking out travel logs, you know, the usual summer tourist books, and finding out, well, who was Guern? And looking up some of the relatives, checking out a couple of the relatives there, the Guerns, well, who was before them? And so it just kept mushrooming and expanding. I started gathering material, not deliberately, it's just well, you don't like it, I can keep quiet. So it's just this tremendous interest in local history, and it just kept mushrooming and ending up building an archives, expanding to the extent that I found the relatives, the direct relatives of who named Guerneville, who was the first person there. It was John W. Bagley, who brought a mill down from Mill Creek. He had a mill running up there. They dragged it down in 1865 into Guerneville, where Safeway parking lot is now. And he was the partners. Well, he was the main partner. He was the one that provided the mill. And then there was Willits, not spelled the same way as the town, different family. Thomas Tobin Heald, related to Harmon Heald, was a partner, and the mill became known as Heald and Guern. The Heald's Mill or Guern's Mill, that was named for the area. And that area, before they established the mill, the whole area was known as Big Bottom, because the Russian River back in 5,000 years ago was a great big bow in the river. And eventually the river eroded through where Johnson's Beach is in Guerneville, so it cut straight across where you have this big horseshoe, this Oxbow Valley behind it and to the north. And slowly filled back in a tremendous timber. This is where Bagley, Heald, Willits, and Willits owned about a half of that bottom land with these monstrous redwood trees that would probably put even Humboldt to shame. Some of the redwoods were measured to being 375 feet tall. Armstrong Park is kind of a remnant of it, but then Guern came in as a young man in his mid-20s from Sonoma. Now, why he got involved, I don't know, but the Guerns came originally from Sonoma. So got hold of the Bagley family. They were quite prominent in Healdsburg. The Guerns basically moved to Guerneville, and so I started talking to the pioneers, and this is going back to 1960 and thereabouts, and I ended up talking to people who had witnessed back then the important events, or those who had marked a chapter, started a new chapter in the river history. And when you first start out in history, you kind of get localized. Well, I was Guerneville. Guerneville's the navel of the world, you know, right there. I have to really study it. And anything that came by Monterey or Rio, well, you know, that was trashy. Well, as I got more and more into doing the history, I come to realize you can't be isolated. Guerneville has an influence on Reno and Monterey and Duncan's Mills, and vice versa also. And so you start gathering more and more material, and when you start gathering material, you say, oh, criminy, now where is this? Oh, State Archives, Sacramento. Okay, so you make an appointment at State Archives, or you make an appointment down here in Petaluma, like with Ed Mannion, who had a fabulous file, you know, of South County information, or Ed Langhart up at Healdsburg, kind of pulling that area in, because Healdsburg was the first big influence on the lower Russian River area. To Guerneville, the other influence was coming down the coast, or up the coast, coming up river, were the Duncan's brothers, which established their first mill up above Fort Ross. And then in 1866, they moved it down to where Bridgehaven, south side of Bridgehaven. Then in 1877, they moved up to where Duncan's Mills is now. And there was this tremendous influence of the lumber industry that prompted the railroad to build towards Guerneville from this side, but also the North Pacific Coast Railroad to come up through Tomales, Occidental, and to Russian River Station, which was before Monterey, and then into Duncan's Mills. Tremendous influence, that was of the industry. Then as they got, as the lumber industry was slowly withering on the vine because they had cut out basically all the stock, the second big chapter on the river area was the tourist industry. Well, how did that get started? Well, that was, they had these lumber companies, the railroad companies, they had these vast tracts of land that had been cut over, and they're paying taxes on this. Well, what can we do? We can subdivide. So they did a lot of subdivision. Rio Neto, Gernwood Park, Vacation Beach, Russian River Heights, which is between Gernwood and Northwood. That whole hillside out there, it's hard to imagine when you look at these areas. Summer Home Park is another one. If you go over River Road at nighttime, you might see one or two lights up there, but during the daytime, you don't see any houses at all. There are pictures of tent cabins. It looks like snow had fallen across the hillside because the trees in the current day forest hadn't grown up yet. So they sold off the lots, but they're no dummies. They divided the lots into 100 by 50 feet. County says, well, that's 5,000 square feet, but that's below county specs. It's supposed to be 60 by 100, or equivalent of 6,000 square. Well, Brenda, you bought that piece of property, but you can't build on it, so I'm gonna have to, would you like to buy the property? It was alongside. So they ended up selling 2 lots to the same party. My grandfather bid for that up in Gernwood when he bought his summer home and built it up there. So that really starts getting the industry of tourism underway. And studying all this history of resorts, lumbering, the pioneers, how they came in. Some of them were living in canyons with their families back in the 1850s before any logging began. It was like living in I guess like the Black Forest back in the medieval era. These were, true pioneers, and so I keep pushing that envelope further and further and further back. And so then joined the county society, and ended up being on the board. I imagine quite a few of you know Harry Lapham, who's the historian emeritus for Santa Rosa in that area. He called me up and said, John, why did you join the county society? Well, I'd already been a member, I let it drop by the wayside. We have a vacancy on the board. Well, okay. So we had that meeting, was at the hotel, the Petaluma Hotel right up here. They had the first elevator, or it was something like that in town. And so I got voted on the board, but I wasn't even a member yet. I mean, they were desperate, obviously. And so with that being on the board, I started writing short stories, little articles for, back then it was called the Journal for the Sonoma County Historical Society. And then for a short while, when Simone Wilson, who was very active and kind of quasi-active now in local history, she was going to take on the job of being editor, but she couldn't do it for about 2 or 3 editions. So I ended up being editor and writing stories for her. And then there was, she left, and another fellow came in. Dadgummit, I can't remember his name.
Lee? Lee?
No. He lived on Martinelli Road just west of Forestville.
Oh.
And he's long gone. But anyway, so I started writing stories for him, and I started really getting in and discovering what historical writing really means. You can't just write a story like fiction or something of that sort. You have to have your footnotes, like somebody will challenge it. And I get challenged a couple of times during the year when I lie a lot. And well, where'd you get that information? Well, it's in the book. It's in the footnotes. You know, I'll try to. Yeah, it's right here. It's right here. And so I ended up teaching myself by accident about how to write historical articles and features and stories. You gotta toe the mark, because otherwise, you know, why are you doing this except for your own pleasure? But that doesn't do any good. Some people will call you up and say, can you find out something about John Bagley or Harry Lapham or one of the Carrillos or something of that sort? So consequently, made up several books. I did one, the first one was this one, Girlies. Guerneville Early Days. And this is the one that I wrote during court. Because we had a lot of spare time. When you have a civil court and you got attorney going against attorney, I'm just sitting there like a bump in the log. And, well, I'd been known to fall asleep during court. No comment from my peers over here. A couple of times I had fallen out of my chair, sound asleep during court. You know, it doesn't improve your reputation any, but I did a lot of research. I get the raw material and then go through it doing the microfilm reading at the county library and what have you. So then I learned to get this thing done. It took me 30 some odd years, and I wrote it 3 or 4 times because I didn't know how to type. I wrote it 3 or 4 times in longhand and legal tablets and constantly revising it. And finally, after 30 years, I got it published. And it was like finally getting my 25-year-old son, whatever. Some of you have experienced this. Aren't they ever going to leave? And when I got this thing published, it's out of the nest. It's gone. I have been saved. You know, I'm back to back to life again. But then there's a spin-off from this. I would get phone calls from people like even back in Wisconsin and Florida. They had heard about that, and I would end up doing research for them or trying to find one of their relatives, and again gathering more material besides Guerneville, but expanding into the river area, and then being in the county society before the Russian River Historical Society started, investigating more other stories, and consequently one of them, 2 or 3 chapters in my Guerneville Early Days, you start out with the Native Americans. You've got to start out, if you're doing a history, you really want to do it correctly. And because of that, took a year's leave of absence, went to Sonoma State, and I threw out all my law enforcement major, and I became an anthropologist. And so I did quite a few stories, a little in bits and pieces, and consequently one of them, I can't remember which one. I think it's it's in this one, the new one. The new one is in this one, and we changed the title a couple of times. Here it's called A Clash of Cultures, First Encounters and Native Wars. And the article I had written for the Historical Society, the County Society, was Sonoma County Indian Wars. Nobody had done anything about conflict for everyday consumption. You have the academics, you know, and the professors or professionals and stuff of that sort. They have studied, but nothing got into print. And I found it real interesting. You had the first section is native versus native. You had the Wapo of Alexander Valley and Sonoma, which is the Wapo area, it's not Pomo, being in conflict with the Pomos, the southern Pomos. And not much with the Miwok here in South County. The difference between the Miwoks and the Pomos is much like in Europe. You have the Latin language and you have the Germanic language. And Miwok and Wapo and Pomo are just as different as the Germanic is from the Latin. Probably even a greater distance between, excuse me, a greater distance in linguistics or in language between the Latins and Swahili. There's that much of a difference in the language. But you shared the same culture, just like England, France, Germany. You still have that European culture, the same thing here. But you still had your differences. You still had conflicts, village versus village, and maybe it got a little bit bigger. So the first part was Indian versus Wapo versus Pomo. And then you had the first encounters with the Spanish and the Russians. Spanish came for one purpose, the Russian came for something else, as most of us know. The Russians kind of got their rear ends kicked when they were coming down through Alaska in the inland passage, you know, with the Haidu and the Kwakiutl, the peoples up there. They came in guns loaded and everything, and when you go into a foreign territory, you better do some reconnoitering to know what you're up against, not only the people, but also the territory. Well, the Russians learned the hard way up there. So when they came down here, they approached the natives, the Coast Miwok and the Pomo, on a different footing. You didn't have that conflict that you had up north. Spanish came in, as we know, they subdued tribe and linguistic groups in various different peoples and different cultures under arms, but for a different purpose to incorporate them into the Catholic religion in Spanish culture. Then you had the conflict of the Americans coming in like with disease, and how when you study that, about when the skies would gray with smoke because of the funeral pyres, because of the disease, especially up in where I came across. It was in Sebastopol area, very, very well populated, but they were dropping just like flies every day. So that's also in here. But another part of Sonoma County Indian Wars, what were the weapons? What was their form of battle? What did they do for preparation? We go through this country and other superpowers. You go through various preparations. There are certain things you do. The Native Americans, the Pomo and the Wapo, they did the same thing. They called upon spirits. They had angelica root they made tea out of, and they threw, I can't remember now, it's been so long. Angelica root, they threw it in the 4 directions, and then they would say, may this blind my enemy, may they never have their sight again, as we go into battle. And the weaponry, they used sharpened spears. They had taken the ground down to a point, put them in the fire to harden the wood. They also had, the Pomos had elderberry rod armor, body armor, that was pretty much impervious to arrows. They used sinew-back bows. There was all sorts of, excuse me, all sorts of weaponry, but there was also the preparation of putting on elderberry rod. What were the weapons? Okay, it's raining. Bows and arrows. The bows aren't going to function because they're sinew-back. So there were various methods of preparing for conflict. And what was the purpose? where they're gonna take over a whole village because they've been offended, or if the person who really perpetrated this conflict was killed, everything stopped and they exchanged gifts and withdrew back to their normal territory. Other stories that I had done for the county society after the Sonoma County Wars, I wanted to know who was Bodega? Don Juan Francisco Bodega y Cuadra. Yeah, I'm using an Anglo accent, but who was this guy? Looked him up, tried to look him up in the library. Well, it was little bits and pieces, you know, thumbnail sketches. So I ended up going to Argonaut Books down in San Francisco, who I bought a lot of history books from down there on Sutter with Bob Haynes. And I even went back and I started buying from his father. His father's been gone now for 50 years. God, how old does that make me? Anyway, and then going up, we went up, so Sarah and I went up to visit my oldest son in Seattle. We continued on up into Canada because I found out that Vancouver Island was originally named Quadra and Vancouver Island, named after Bodega. And Vancouver, well, wait a minute, what's this all about? So went to their archive, not archive, but their provincial library, and got a bunch of information about what he was doing up there. There's still an island named for him up there, Quadra Island. There are about 4 or 5 locations in British Columbia, 4 or 5 locations in Alaska, as well as here, named after Bodega. I was like, whoa, who was this fellow? So I put together a biography, just scraping it together. And so those who are really interested, I have his biography as a part of the hidden histories of Sonoma County. Where would you find it? This is kind of what I call a hidden history. Another little hidden history, which has been kind of fun, was the Stagecoach Gang out of Cloverdale. The Hooks Gang, H-O-U-X. It's actually French, is pronounced who. But his gang, what really caught my attention was that Hooks was functioning out of Cloverdale. But his gang was Bigfoot Andrews, Lodi Brown, Rattlejack, and I can't remember who the fifth one was. I figured, God, with a bunch of names like that, this sounds like Scarface Capone, you know, Babyface Nelson, you know, from our era. And so I started doing research on that. A couple of people were killed. Rattlejack was. It was the first stagecoach robbery that took place just south of Asti. And it was at nighttime, and shots rang out, and Rattlejack got shot. But they made off with the Wells Fargo box. And Rattlejack died between Alexander Valley and Dry Creek Valley. And they buried him out there. Nobody knows, because they threw him in the dirt at nighttime. You know, they wanted to get out of Dodge right away with the Wells Fargo box. There were a couple of chases that took place, and I found it fascinating in how when they were captured, it was by an undercover agent from Wells Fargo. Let's see, there was one fellow who was killed, a passenger was killed on the stagecoach heading up to Cloverdale. And it got to the point where merchants were sending their monies back and forth, or any of the valuables, in wagons covered with hay, feed bags, anything of that sort, under disguise. Not all. You'll think that maybe most of the stories have to do with law enforcement. There is a chapter in here where I did the history of Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, but there's also the Red Light District of Santa Rosa. Everybody says, well, yeah, but we don't talk about that sort of thing. You know, it existed some other time or some other place. It didn't exist here. Well, come to find out, there was a red light district in Santa Rosa, and discovered the names of the madams and some of the girls, and where it was located on First Street, right where the Santa Rosa post office is, between D and C Street, down where Chinatown used to be located. And a lot of these names came up because it was a civil suit by a church-going lady who was living on Second Street, and her back fence went to First Street. Well, during the county fair and the horse races, in the evening, the guys would line up for the various houses, but if they've got so much business, they would line up along the fence on her side of the street, and there was all this swearing going on and everything, so she sued the city for allowing this to take place. So all this information came out in transcripts and stuff of that sort. It was great. So it came out in the Historical Society, the County Society Journal, and Gay LeBaron latched onto it, and I can't remember the title of her column. It came out about 2 months later. And the only title I can remember, I think it's correct, was, "Is this a fit subject for Sunday?" which used to do her Sunday columns. And she called me up and I said, well, I was going to kind of expand on it, but tell you what, Gay, I'll give you Petaluma. So she wrote about the greenhouse. And so it's a little hidden history, or forgotten, one that's kind of swept under the carpet. You know, we don't talk about that sort of thing. Well, when I did my Guerneville history, I uncovered everything I could. Homicides, the history of the churches, but also the house of ill repute. Came across a photograph of this lady, and several photographs, and when she was dressed and when she was undressed, and we used on the cover of the County Society's Journal. It was I can't remember what the title of it was on the cover of it, and here she's standing, and it was at the turn of the century. Well, the gentlemen liked their women on the heavyset side. This is like the days of Little Egypt, out of St. Louis, what have you. And Campbell Perry, he was the editor. He was the one that I did the biography for in the Red Light District. And so he took the picture and he cut her just above. She's standing there demurely, fat cheeks, and it's just, and her name was Oakland Nell. And so she's, sometimes the guys will say to me, or get hold of me, or the gal will say, how's Oakland Nell doing? I don't know, she was long gone before I've ever hit this planet. So it seems like quite a bit about the criminal side. Another story in here was, which really kind of amazed me, was the tobacco industry of Sonoma County. A fellow in Guerneville, Dave Hetzel, he survived the Civil War, came out here in California, and he started growing tobacco up by the Quicksilver mine up in Mount Jackson. It wasn't panning out. He and a partner named Schuler. Schuler eventually ended up being down here as a tobaccoist here in Petaluma. But Hetzel kept experimenting, and he ended up with having vast fields of tobacco in the river bottomland. And this is not you think of tobacco being more for the tropical area, but here he was growing up here in Guerneville, Northwood, the flats, the lower bench, as you call it, between Guerneville and Rio Neto, right where the bridges are now in Guerneville. Vast, big fields of tobacco in there. And I have a lot of photos of his growing of the tobacco. He cured it. He made his own cigars and everything. And eventually he ended up being almost the sole supplier for the Bohemian Club, because they would come through on their summer excursion. They'd stop and load up the cigars and head down to the Grove. and he would supply them down in San Francisco. Well, one time, a friend of his said, I'm going back to the World's Fair at St. Louis. He says, I'm going to take a show him, you know, we can grow tobacco out here. So Dave said, yeah, go ahead and help yourself. So he grabbed a bunch of tobacco, took it back to St. Louis, and this is after it had been plucked after several weeks. He's taking the train, you know, heading back there. And the fellow tried to find a Sonoma display. Well, there wasn't any. Sonoma County didn't have any there. The nearest one was Solano. So the guy got a table and said, can I put this out there and hang a sign? Yeah, go ahead. So he put out this tobacco and hung up, put a sign out there. And lo and behold, the commission or the judges, whatever, came by and, well, look at this. Hetzel ended up getting an award. He didn't know anything about it. He hadn't even formally entered the competition. So the next thing you know, he gets this thing and he said, well, what's all this about? So this kind of stimulated some of the other people here in Sonoma County in growing. There were very small patches. Farmers had like prunes like up in Healdsburg, you know, and so they would try a patch of tobacco. And down here, well, we'll use chicken manure and see what we can develop in the way of growing tobacco. Up in Cloverdale, they started producing or making a company produce commercially. It was called the Heritage Tobacco Company. And vast fields up there. They survived for about 5-6 years. And so I said, oh, I came across a little article in the Press Democrat. You know, the Heritage Tobacco Company of Cloverdale is starting to sell stock. And it was just this little blurb. Oh, well, what's this all about? So I went up to the Cloverdale Historical Society and said, I showed them all the material I had. I said, we've never heard of it. I said, this is, you know, don't you have any photos? Nothing? Anything. They had nothing. So, you know, Guerneville strikes again, you know, the river area. And so there's a chapter in here, another part of the hidden history of Sonoma County, the tobacco industry, the tobacco growing up in Cloverdale. What other ones do I have in here? God, I've written some darn many short stories. The last rides from Cazadero, the last train ride out of Cazadero, the last ride 3 years later out of Guerneville. Then I did one on the first automobiles in Sonoma County, the people who had licenses. And this was 1910. I can't remember, I got so much garbage up here. Came across, it was called the Blue Book of Automobile Drivers, and it was a list of everybody who had a license in California. There was something like 12,000 people, and I bought the book. And then there's this little tiny print, you know, like in the telephone books, you can't, you get old enough, your eyes get big, but the print gets small. And so I went through here and I pulled out every name that had to do with Sonoma County. And it listed like who had, some women here in Petaluma had 2 automobiles. And I broke it down. Who had the most automobiles at this period? Petaluma did. Then Santa Rosa. There were some in Sonoma, in town of Sonoma. Sebastopol, 1 or 2 up in Healdsburg. And so it was a great breakdown. Doctors, there were several doctors that had automobiles. They didn't really list the makes, you know, whether it were Chevys, Duriers, Maxwells, you know, anything of that sort. But it listed the people who had licenses. And I thought, okay, I broke it down and I had the whole list of the ladies and the men, and also there were companies that have like for cabs and what have you. So that was another little hidden history of Sonoma County. So it's a compilation of short stories. Golly, I've forgotten I have that one in there. Probably the first photograph of Fort Ross in 1865. You think about how difficult it was to make photographs. You made your plates, you put your chemical, you made that film on it, put it in your slide holder, get out the camera, expose it, put your blade back over it, come back out. You had to develop it within 30 minutes. and you're hauling all this equipment and everything all around, you know, the countryside. Those of you who've seen the photographs of the Transcontinental Railroad, how God, I can't remember the photographer's name, hauling his magic wagon with all this chemistry clear across the continent, or, you know, from Council Bluffs, Iowa, coming this way, hauling it and making those photographs, you know, what they had to go through. I might do one on photographers of Sonoma County, which would be a knockout to, it would be a lot of fun. In the last journal, I guess there's none here, we did for the Russian River Historical Society. I passed them out at our Heritage Network, which we meet every quarter, and it moves all around the county where all the societies get together, or most of them. And we exchange information, stuff of that sort. And I brought a bunch of extras of yesterday and yesteryear, is what we call the Russian River Society. And this last issue was, excuse me, woodcuts and steel engravings. And it was only 2 photographs that I put in the whole issue of 12 pages. It's mostly of woodcuts and steel engravings. And I had 2 photos. And then, excuse me, cheap whiskey. There were photographs made by Joseph H.P. Downing from Healdsburg. He made the first photographs of Guerneville in 1872. This is 5 years before the railroad ever arrived. Then after the railroad came in, Heel and Gurn, no, it was Gurn and Murphy then, 1889. They bought a small locomotive because they were going to expand their cutting and their timbering up Gurnwood, up the canyon, up Hulbert Canyon. So Downing made a couple of photographs, and there was John Muir. There was a Picturesque California, a big heavy book. It's got all sorts of engravings, steel engravings, and some fabulous stuff. Well, I got the 2 photos, and then the engravings made about 9 years later from off those photos. You could see how they copied them, but then went through. Like a lot of you remember the Atlas of 1877, you know, the Thompson Atlas, those woodcuts that are in there. And these were very important, not so much for the Atlas or for a magazine, but also that was the photographs that they were used in newspapers. They'd get a photograph and they had the engravers or the wood carvers. They had to hurry up and get that done because news being timely, you had to have a picture to go along with it. So you see some of these kind of crude looking woodcuts in the newspapers because they were trying to get it in. It was to attract more business for the periodical. That was a real great. That was another fun one. Like all of a sudden the idea came, let's do steel cuts and wood engraving to show where they came from. And some of the steel engravings, I know a lot of you will recognize that if you look at old bill heads from the turn of the century, 1900 or earlier, those beautiful steel engravings of the business, you know, whether it happens to be the Press Democrat or the Argus Courier, or advertising for mills, or the livery, the stagecoaches, you know, fabulous drawings. Those were the photographs, you know, they didn't have photographs, but the closest thing to it, and a fabulous source for history, for local history. Kind of a spin-off, or before that I did one here. I brought them down just to look at, and it's Tales of the Russian River, the Stumptown Stories. I had written, I had a column through the Guerneville newspapers up there, Stumptown Stories, and it was little anecdotes, like those of you who had read Ed Mannion's, like Looking in the Rearview Mirror, side view, rearview mirror, something like that. Anecdotes about the river area, about the first jail, the first automobiles, the baseball teams that were up there at the turn of the century. She's here, she's here. You know who I'm talking about. Yeah, there she is, Oakland Nell. It was in this book, but there's one where she's rather revealing. So there was, oh yeah, I got Hetzel's tobacco in here. It's been quite a while. You go on, you move on to other things. The Snows and the Ice Company that developed when we used to have big freezes here in Sonoma County. Russian River froze over for a couple of weeks, and they made it a spontaneous ice company. And so they were out there cutting ice out of the river and stocking it up for summer. Lord knows what that water looked like, what have you. But anyway, that's it. I don't know how much more you want me to talk about. I won't talk about judges that I have known and the secret stories of the dungeons in the sheriff's office. Yeah, if there are any questions,
So like to open up for questions, John, and then
Yeah.
after we're done, we'll let you sign
I don't
some.
know, how long did I
notes.
talk anyway? Half hour, 45 minutes?
About 40 minutes. You've done good. You
Oh,
were worried.
yeah,
I wasn't worried.
well, historians, you end up being a historian of a certain area. You end up being an expert, and if you're an expert, who's going to challenge you? So you get to lie a lot. That's the fun thing about it. Yeah. So if there are any questions, come up and take a look. These are the societies, the Petaluma Society's books here. Heck. So have at it. Any questions? Mining, yes.
Did you ever have to go to the Bancroft for anything?
Oh,
Open-
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Naturally, yeah. Had them dig stuff out of their archives at the warehouse for Heel and Gurn's Mill. That was one, and also for doing some of the railroad material that I did. I also went to what's called CSRM, California State Railroad Museum. Go up to their archives, and I've donated stuff to them and have gone over there. Yeah, it's the big thing about writing history for me, and it's not publishing. It's not the publishing. Sure, it's a side benefit, but it's the pursuit, chasing that paper chase. Of finding out it's like in law enforcement, you're investigating, you're doing detective work, and sometimes you get called on the carpet for you're wrong, and so you go back. I made a mistake, and you try to correct it, but it's the chase. It's that doing that research, the chase, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes this guy said one thing 20 years ago.
Yeah, right. Talking to John Burton over here, who's got 2 books out, just came out within the last couple of months.
One was yesterday.
Yeah, how brief can you, how new can you get? Yes, Mr. Reverend Cool.
Any unique stories about Cazadero?
Stagecoach holdup. There was 2 guys that went through there. I wrote a story about them. They hoofed it. They held up the stage in the middle of the night, and they hoofed it from there to Guerneville. And everybody was scouring the countryside and come across Jim Berry, of Berry's Mill up there. He had copies of a diary. God, was it the Moharts of the Wards? Anyway, in the diary, the lady of the house, she would write down stuff every day, and there was at the date that this stagecoach comes, 2 peculiar strangers came through town. And it just fit right in there. And then they chased them all over the place, and they caught one over in Vacaville. One of them turned himself in. Let's see, what else? What other ones? The Croesus mine. Was that a magnesite mine? The Croesus ghost, the ghost of the mine up there. And it was reported in the newspapers. There were several articles. The guys were digging in this mine near Cazadero, and they had regular cook shack and the bunkhouse and tool shed. And they kept hearing stuff, tools being thrown around during the nighttime to go out, and the tools hadn't been disturbed, but they kept hearing this sound. And one of the Sterretts, God, which was a big name up in the river area, he was down in the hole digging and what have you, and he heard a sound, and he turned around, and here was another fellow standing alongside of him. And he says, well, are you new here or something like that? And it didn't, this image didn't answer him. He says, well, if you're going to stick around, I'm getting out of here. And he got pulled out, and that was the last they saw of him. But that was up by Cazadero. Anything else can I lie about?
You said it took you 30 years to write your first book, so when did that book get published? What year?
1997. 1997, 1998.
Do I get a follow-up question?
I'm not going to do a follow-up?
No, can I ask a follow-up
Oh, sure,
question?
sure.
Did you get a computer before you finished that, or did you do it all longhand?
I did this all longhand. Then I got Simone Wilson. I hired her as an agent because she was she knew computers. And the first time I saw her scan a photograph, and she says, "Boy, that looks a little flat." And so she goes, all this magic stuff with the finger, abracadabra. And all of a sudden, the contrast and everything's like, whoa, this is magic. I imagine, like the first time you saw a plane, the very first airplane that flew over the country here, you're like, somebody's really flying. I was a kid. I was just like amazed. Like the first time I ever saw television. Look at this. It's better than the original. And then cropping and then doing all this. So she was my agent for it. But boy, I was so happy to get that thing published. It was hanging around my neck. But the spinoff is here and joining the historical societies. Anything else?
Corbell, tobacco?
Oh, tobacco, yeah.
Yeah.
They experimented the Corbells, where Corbell is now. They actually started out down in San Francisco with a printing press and making cigar boxes, and they consequently came up to where the winery is now and established themselves before the coming of the railroad. And started the redwood, started milling redwoods there, and made lumber like crazy. But also the redwood was milled primarily for cigar boxes. They cut boxes for Hetzel's Tobacco. That's where he got all his boxes from, and they printed the labels for his cigar boxes. They had all that area that you see now, but they also owned all of Rio Neto. They logged Rio Neto out, then they sold out, and then it was subdivided. I think, was it the Moose or the Elks? They were seriously thinking about buying it, but then they backed out, and another company came in and bought it up and subdivided it. But as Corbell started clearing off land, they said, okay, what can we produce here? Let's make this land still productive. So they tried orchards, excuse me, apple orchards, they tried prunes, they tried tobacco, they did dairy work there, but they settled on grapes, and that's when they started calling in, because they were familiar with that from their old country over in Bohemia and Bavaria, so they started calling in the old families over from the old country and coming in, and that's how they really got anchored into doing wine and then getting into champagne. Nothing else? Okay, would you put your notes away, please? I'm going to pass out pencils and paper. It's going to be a written exam. There will be a couple of true and false questions there for you, okay? So that's all I have.